Well, today we'll be discussing the financial aid basics with the Director of Financial Aid Services.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. So I'll go ahead and jump into our very first question. What does the SMU Financial Aid Services Office do?
Yeah, so this is a great question because we do understand that financial aid offices at different universities sometimes do different things. Generally speaking, we all work with administering and determining eligibility for federal aid programs. We also determine eligibility for state aid programs for those students that are Texas residents. And then here at SMU, we also use the results of the financial aid applications to determine eligibility for need-based institutional aid. And I do want to stress that what we specifically oversee and again administer are those need-based institutional aid programs. When we're thinking about scholarships, so merit scholarships or departmental scholarships, those are actually determined by other offices, and then they let us know who's qualifying and what amounts are being received so that we can facilitate the awarding and disbursement of those funds. So primarily what we oversee here at SMU are federal aid, which students qualify for through the FAFSA, and institutional need-based aid, as well as some state aid programs.
All right, thank you. So if a student is incoming, how do they apply for financial aid?
Yeah, so it is a two-step process here. So the first and big thing to complete is what's called the FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid. That is how a student applies to be considered for the federal Pell Grant, as well as federal student loans. In addition, we'll use the results of that application to determine eligibility for any state aid programs, again, for those Texas residents. In addition to the FAFSA, we also ask students to complete what's called the CSS profile. That's very similar to the FAFSA. It asks almost all the same questions, but it just gets a little more granular into a family's financial situation, just so we have a more complete picture of what a family is experiencing in terms of those finances. And what we specifically use the results of that CSS profile for is determining eligibility for need-based institutional aid programs, most commonly the SMU Opportunity Award.
So after a student submits their forms to the financial aid office, what additional information do they need?
So because we do collect two different forms, but they have very similar information, one of the things we look for is conflicting information. So on both the FAFSA and profile, a student and their parents, if they are considered to be dependent, are providing their income information, as well as certain information about their family size and the number of people that may be attending college. And if there are any conflicts with how that information is reported between the FAFSA and the profile, we do have to investigate a little further, just make sure we have the right numbers, we're working with the right information. And so that most typically means we're collecting tax return information or clarifying family size. And how we let a student know if that's something we need to do, if that's a continuing process we need to work through, is we add to-do items in their my.smu dashboard, which they access at my.smu.edu. We also send students emails to their SMU email address, and I do want to note that one more time. We specifically reach out to the SMU email address, not a student's personal email. So if there is anything that we need to clarify, again, whether that's income information, sometimes we have to clarify citizenship status or what the government refers to as eligible non-citizenship status, which most commonly is permanent residency. So if we need any kind of that information, any kind of documentation to clarify those, again, we will add those to-do items in my.smu, as well as reach out to the student. And then once we clarify that, we get that all sorted out, then we can move forward with determining the financial aid offer.
So if a student is looking in their my.smu account, when do they need to accept their financial aid, and when do payment plans need to be put in place?
Yeah, so I'll take that in two parts. So as far as accepting the financial aid that's been offered, so something to note and just to be aware of in terms of timeframes is financial aid disperses up to 10 days before the start of a semester. So if we have a spring semester that's starting on January 20th, for example, then aid will start dispersing as early as January 10th. So we want to make sure any aid that a student wants is accepted by that time frame, again, that 10 days before. Additionally, typically the payment due date is going to be 3 days after aid disperses. So using that example, if aid's dispersing on January 10th, for the spring semester, then the payment due date for the spring semester is going to be around January 13th. Now, some things to note about the financial aid that's offered: any grants or scholarships will automatically be accepted. The things that students need to go out and actively confirm, actively accept, are going to be student loans if they do want to participate in those programs, or what's called federal work study. If they're looking at working on campus and want to participate in that program, they would have to go out into their my.smu portal and accept that aid that they want to take. So again, we really, when we're thinking about aid and accepting and making sure it all goes when we want, it just needs to be prior to that 10 days before the start of a semester. Now, when it comes to payment plans, there are some different timeframes and deadlines with those, because depending on when a student signs up for a payment plan, it could affect the number of months that they're given to make payments, as well as how much may be due up front. Now, we do post those timeframes and deadlines on our webpage, on the Student Financial Services website. But we also want to have that in place prior to the semester starting. So it's something to be looking into, because again, with those timeframes, with those deadlines, eventually those payment plans do cut off. So we want to be looking at that before we're getting to the semester.
So this next question, Robert, would be important for both our incoming and transfer students. So how many years can students receive financial aid?
So this is my favorite answer to any financial aid question: it depends. So there are different types of aid. We've talked a little bit about there's federal aid, there's state aid, there's institutional aid. So I'm going to start with institutional aid first. So depending on what type of student we're talking about. So if it's a regular, just incoming student and they're qualifying for merit aid, merit scholarships, they have up to 8 semesters of eligibility, or 4 academic years. You can think about it in that way as well. If it's a transfer student that is not receiving merit aid, they have 5 semesters of eligibility for any other institutional aid they may be qualifying for. But if we have a transfer student that is qualifying for a merit scholarship, they get 6 semesters of eligibility. Now, as we approach those different timeframes, the 5 semesters or 6 semesters or 8 semesters, and a student is finding that they're going to need an extra term or maybe an extra year, maybe they changed majors or something occurred where they just need a little bit of extra time, we do have an appeals process for being considered for an additional term or year of institutional aid, and they would just need to contact financial aid services to pursue that. Now, outside of institutional aid, when it comes to federal aid, it's a little bit different. So the federal Pell Grant, students can receive up to 600% of their eligibility as determined by the FAFSA, and that typically translates to 12 semesters is kind of how it breaks down. Then with federal loans, it's really about what are called the aggregate limits. So there's an overall total that students can borrow. So for dependent students, they can borrow up to $31,000, and that's a combination of subsidized and unsubsidized loans. And then for independent students, and I want to also take a moment to say that dependency is determined by the FAFSA. So they tell us if you're dependent or independent. So for independent students, they can borrow up to $57,500. And again, that's a combination of subsidized and unsubsidized loans. In both cases, whether it's $31,000 or $57,500, the most in subsidized loans a student can borrow is $23,000. So the difference with either number is going to be those unsubsidized loan amounts. So for some aid, we have time frame. For some aid, we have just overall totals that can be received. And we do have all this information published on our webpage as well. That's Student Financial Services website.
Well, thank you, Robert. And thank you, Mustangs, for tuning into this episode of Red, Blue, and You. We'll have episode 2 coming up with Robert next with our hot topics in financial aid. Go Mustangs.